in the case of science advice for climate and COVID, because they are completely opposite situations. For climate, the science is very, very well understood and has been understood for a couple of decades now. The solutions are known, but the problem is the implementation, the lag in implementation. It doesn't go fast enough. For COVID, exactly the opposite. We lacked data, we lacked understanding of the microbiology, of the epidemiology. And throughout the pandemic, when Omicron came quite late, still people had no idea about how contagious it would be. On the other hand, policymakers were really keen to engage, to take quick, bold, decisive action, even though the data were not there. So it's really the opposite situation. And as a result, science advisors were put in a very, very different spot because the context was so different. So it is also, the way science advising works is also highly context dependent. Thank you to all the great panelists who share their incredible wisdom. I've learned a lot as being quite new in this job. So thank you so much for that.
And thank you very much to you, Eric Lambin, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Antonio Loprieno, the messages you take away from the last 2 days.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Well, I don't know if you make the same experience or have made the same experience that I have in my professional life, but usually wrap-up talks are a failure because you figure out, well, this person should have stayed where he or she was. Now, what my friend Eric said is an exception to that because he wrapped up in a perfect way. So what I can so perhaps share with you are two pieces of wisdom, or two experiences that I've made during the last 2 days, listening to the panels and of exceptional quality, all of them, and the working groups. One is that in order to understand reality, we as human beings usually need sharpness and we need contrast, but reality itself is probably more of the analog than of the digital type. And it has very many gray areas in between. And I would like to mention this in relationship to two oppositions or two continuums that have played a role in the last 2 days. One is the dialogue between science advice and the communication of science communication. We have heard that obviously we need to keep the two sides very separate because they fulfill a different role in society. And yet, on many instances, the needs of the two communities overlap precisely in a knowledge-intensive society such as ours. The second example in which we need sharp divides in order to be procedurally correct, but where the reality may be rather in the gray area, is what started at the beginning of this conference as a polarity between science advice and policy making, and what was, thanks also to the intervention of Sir Patrick, what has become more of a triad. So with science advice, policy advice, and policy making, which is a level of a very insightful, but level of complexity. But of course, it makes the job for us all a bit difficult to really precisely understand what your specific function is. The good news for us in the European scientific advice mechanism is that this is precisely what we experience daily at SAM, where we have a component in terms of science advice, a component in terms of policy advice, and then the policy making itself. What I also took as a message is that perhaps what we call science advice also is of a different nature. We are talking of different advice depending on the context in which we are called to operate, and particularly the opposition between the national context, where usually a form of closeness or easier than at the transnational level, where you need a level of transparency also that you cannot have when making political decisions at the national level. So all sorts of balances that need to be considered in our future work, and for which we, from the SAPEA side of SAM, very much thank all the participants. Now, it's my job also, as the last speaker before the keynote by Director General Paquet, to thank the organizers of this so really very successful event, although it's not my job to say that it's a successful something that you kind of contributed to, but let's say not because of the own merit. First of all, I would like to regret the absence of Chief Scientific Advisors Nicole Grobert and Nebojsa Nekicenovic, who both of them were struck by the late consequences of the pandemic, probably. So before coming here, but that who have contributed very, very directly to the formation and the conception of this conference. Then, of course, it's not my job to thank my boss, but I would like to thank you, Eric, for also guiding us from the side of the chief scientific advisors in this in today's event. Then, of course, the thank to the technical staff, and here I would particularly like to thank Johan Jonkers for his team for a fantastic organization and direction, the simulation designers, Piotr Magnuszewski and his team, and of course the organizational staff, so in particular, Alessandro Allegra of the SAM unit and Agnieszka Pietruchuk of SAPEA. A particular thank to you, Jackie, for an incredibly active, participationally oriented and creative direction of our discussions. And as you can imagine, this list that I just recited, and of course I've eliminated very many, those that were too close to me. I said, well, I don't need to thank them explicitly because I will do it in person, but one person who is very close to me and who is actually the author of this list that I just recited, and who is probably the person that most of all bears the responsibility conceptually and organizationally of what we have experienced in the last 2 days, Toby Wardman, Communication Officer, Chief of Communication at SAPEA. It's a great pleasure, Toby, to work with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Antonio said that it's not his job to say it was very successful. We hope to get your feedback, and we hope you have found it very successful. You will be sent evaluation forms by email to find out whether you can indeed confirm the success of this venture. But it is now my great pleasure to give the floor to Jean-Eric Paquet, Director General for Research and Innovation at the Commission, for the closing keynote. Great to have you with us, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here representing Maria Gabriel, who was meant to give you the keynote. So thanks to that, I got an upgrade and I was not in the panel, Stephen, with you, but I can now try to share a few considerations, and I will avoid a wrap-up, obviously, for the good reasons you said, and also because, of course, I didn't attend your conference. So don't take this so much as a keynote, then my sharing on behalf of the teams here in DG Research and Innovation, and Stephen, if you allow, the joint teams between the Joint Research Center and DG Research and Innovation, a few considerations on science, policy making, and then very specifically what indeed you underlined already, the continuum which is needed between science advice and policy advice, so that policy making can indeed take this into account. But let me start by underlining that I think there is no doubt to be had that we need more knowledge from science. We need it for two broad reasons, which I'm sure you discussed during the day. The first one is the obvious complexity of the challenges we are facing as societies. I mean, the climate, biodiversity, just transition one in itself is one which cuts across the sectors, cuts across timelines, and has many, many synergies, but like many trade-offs. And that complexity cannot be tackled as such by policy analysis alone. It needs deep scientific knowledge, not just to inform it, but to have the breadth of understanding to start working on policy solutions. So obviously there's a lot of institutional and policy setups which are needed to use the knowledge from science, but it needs to come from science primarily because of the complexity at stake. The second reason why we need science-based knowledge is because today's political world is dominated by narratives, narratives against narratives. And the reality of that is that what I think existed maybe just 10 or 20 years ago still, that political discussions were based on at least a reasonable consensus on what the facts were, is not existing to an extent anymore in very important and very numerous policy debates. And this is again where science-based evidence is so important. So no doubt about that. And with that, I think we absolutely need to ensure that as institutions, administrations, we do the necessary to equip you with the capacity to provide that knowledge. And that is not just your science, but science which is indeed deployed, knowledge creation which is deployed to support these knowledge needs. And that's certainly funding for that type of scientific research. And it is also very much what Stephen is doing with the support of the science team in DG Research and Innovation. We are working on a staff working document. I'm sure, Stephen, you explained that already, where we will look, where we will do a stock taking and then try to review the tools available with a view to upgrading them against these needs. Now that's, if you want, the broad picture which I wanted to share, saying how important knowledge creation and science is, and how much we will continue as European Commission, have no doubt on that, to invest in it, including with the, in fact, rather well-funded second pillar and cluster 2 in particular of Horizon Europe. Now, science advice under pressure is, of course, very much about science advice to policymakers, and that was also largely the two concluding remarks which I now heard as I arrived. And here I think what I would like to share is firstly one consideration of the past. Well, not past, I am still a policymaker. Stephen, we are policymakers. We are not politicians, but we are policymakers. And I think it has been in my 20 years of policymaking, there's no doubt that with the teams which worked with me and as a person myself, we have always massively invested in a strong evidence base. That's absolutely the hallmark of EU policymaking. However, I don't think that I have over these 20 years, and to an extent, including in my present responsibilities for research policy, been effectively in a position to use science advice as such. So is it a failure on my side? No doubt it certainly is in part as well. Or is it indeed that science advice is not always tailored, available at the juncture of a need and a process, an institutional process happening across public administrations? I think this issue of synchronicity is really absolutely key to ensure that science advice is relevant and more relevant than was the case in the past. I think what I'm saying here from my personal experience as policymaker is also very much an ongoing discussion by the chief scientific advisors of the Commission, by the group, which is a great group, one which has, I think, an amazing depth of knowledge and variety of backgrounds, and which is producing really top-notch advice. The challenge we have as administration supporting you as scientists is that I think we have not yet found the sweet spot where we produce advice which is effectively not just actionable, but effectively fully used. I think the opinions are certainly interesting politically, but they are often difficult to use when you are working on a policy initiative, on a piece of legislation, the connection is not completely straightforward. So in fact, rather difficult to translate the policy advice, the scientific advice, into straightforward policy advice which genuinely impacts the production of Commission initiatives. And I think this is something which I think you all know, and I'm saying this as a responsibility not on the group, but much more on the Commission, and probably particularly on DG Research and Innovation, which is supporting the group and which role is to connect you as a science group with the support, obviously, of scientific academies and SAPEA across Europe, to better connect you with the daily policy making in the Commission. And that probably requires that the broader setup is looked into, that maybe the depth of the science advice production is looked into with maybe a bit of flexibility between longer term strategic deep opinions which need to be constructed over time, and in occasions maybe more agile, tailor-made scientific advice, so that it can indeed feed into the policy making and the preparation of initiatives. I think it's a balance between the two which is not there yet, which is not easy to get to, quite frankly, including because it requires a lot of availability and a lot of resources, availability on the side of the advisors, resources on the side of the Commission. Both are scarce. So I'm well aware that this is not easy. And the way I'm describing it here and now is my own experience and my own little piece of wisdom. But I very much know that Gilles Laroche, who is now leading the team on our side with his colleagues and the group, are precisely looking at how we can make that science advice better connected to policy advice, more actionable, so that indeed our policies continue to be evidence-based on the science from the Joint Research Center, but also then even brought to the next quality level with the science advice coming directly from the science community through the group of science advisors of the Commission. So work ahead of us, where I think today's work, no doubt, is the basis. And we will certainly be able, in this setup, to report back. I think it's a yearly event. Is it a yearly event? It's a regular event anyway. So we will be happy to come back. And we will also be quite happy to hear you as we now move forward, sharing your own views on the path to make science advice even more central for the quality of policy making in the Commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. From there, the way we need to move forward, but also some of those difficult questions which we have begun discussing here today, but which merit a great deal more discussion. Thank you to you. I would just like to add my thanks to all our speakers who've been utterly brilliant. It's been fascinating and a privilege to moderate. Thank you from me too to the organizers and the tech team. Most of all, thank you to all of you who joined us here. It's lovely to see human beings again, but also it's been lovely to have so many of you also joining us online. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we close. There is a side event this afternoon organized by the International Network for Government Science Advice and the International Science Council with an intriguing title: If COVID-19 is the 9/11 moment for global science advice, what needs to happen next? If you haven't already registered, you're still very welcome to join. It starts at 2 o'clock upstairs in room 1 on the first floor here in the hotel. Lunch is served for those who can stay, and it only remains for me to wish you all a very pleasant rest of the day. And thank you again for coming and being part of such fascinating discussions. Goodbye.